Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Gisette Domelorido. I'm a lecturer in sociophonetics, and I'm joined by Professor Janet Watson. We're both based at the University of Leeds. And in practical terms, I'll introduce the session briefly, and then Janet will chair the questions at the end. And just to let you know that we're recording the session, but we'll only record the talk. We'll stop the recording before questions start. So we're delighted to have Dr. Gerald Roche here with us today. And we're particularly grateful because it's 9 p.m. where he's based in Australia. So he is an anthropologist, a senior research fellow in the Department of Politics, Media and Philosophy at LaTrobe University, and a co-chair of the Global Coalition of Language Rights. So very brief background about what we thought about this talk. So we recently discussed Dr. Roche's article on necropolitics of language oppression and found that the ideas could be really key in helping us shape how we think about language diversity between languages, but perhaps also within languages as well. And we thought that was particularly relevant for the networks that we're involved in. So the Center for Endangered Languages, Cultures and Ecosystems that Janet co-leads, and the Language Elite Network, Embracing Linguistic Diversity, that I co-lead with Milena. We're also joined by lots of other speakers, so everyone's very welcome, and thank you very much for being here today. That's all from me, I think. So over to you, Gerald, and thank you very much.
Okay, I'll just get my presentation up. Yeah. Now we've all been on Zoom for many years, but nonetheless, I will ask the mandatory question of can you hear me? Can you see me? Is everything still working? Great. Okay, so thanks very much, Hise and Janet, for the invitation to speak to everyone here. Really looking forward to sharing my work with you and to having a conversation after the talk. I hope that some of the ideas that I present this evening are interesting and provocative and useful for all of you. But my aim is to speak for about 40 minutes and then to leave the rest of the time for questions. So we'll go from there. Okay, so I just want to begin with an acknowledgement of country, an acknowledgement that I'm speaking from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And this is their land. It's Aboriginal land. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. It's also the home of an ongoing struggle. There's an ongoing struggle to reconstruct the language after it was ravaged by invasion, and to reclaim and revitalize that language and to begin using it and transmitting it once again. And so when we often do these land acknowledgements of country in Australia, and we talk about it being unceded land, and I think it's really important when we do that to think about, well, what's the historical circumstances that made it necessary to do this? What's my involvement with and complicity in the ongoing power structures that were established at invasion and so on? So one of the things that I often think about is the fact that I'm an employee of a university called LaTrobe University. It's named after Charles LaTrobe, who was the senior colonial official here in the city of Melbourne from the early 1840s until the 1850s. This was not long after the settlement was officially formed in the mid-1830s. And so he was the chief colonial official here who oversaw a massive influx of European settlers, mostly British. He engaged in campaigns to attempt to permanently expel Indigenous people from the area of the city of Melbourne. He provided impunity for and encouragement for massacres of Indigenous people that took place around the state. He also helped to establish the English medium education system that was part of the processes that destroyed Indigenous languages in this place. And so, yeah, I think if we're going to acknowledge country, we also need to acknowledge our involvement in the history that dispossessed people from that land. And, you know, this is not just important to do in an abstract sense, it's also directly related to what I'm going to be talking about tonight, and that'll become clearer as I go along. I'll just point out that in addition to the map that I've got there showing the various language groups of this area, there's a QR code up in the top right-hand corner, and I've got a couple of these QR codes as we go along, and they're mostly linking you through to relevant publications. So if you follow that QR code through, that will take you to the university's official website where it provides historical background on Charles LaTrobe, and it acknowledges these things. So these quotes that you can see here about him playing an integral role in dispossession of Aboriginal peoples and so on, that's from the university's official website, which to me only raises the question of why would you name a university after such a person, right? To me, I don't think we should have an institution named after someone like this. Anyway, let's get on with the evening's the substance of the talk. So I as he said, I'm going to be talking about some of the ideas that I shared in this article, The Necropolitics of Language Oppression. I'm aware that some people might have read it, or you might want to just go read it instead of listening to me read it. So instead of just giving you the article in speech, in a talk format, I've mixed it up. I've added in some new materials, and I also wanted to give some indication of how I've extended this research since this article was published, and some of the more recent work that I've been doing. But basically, what I want to start with is a discussion of the empirical basis for the article. Why do we need to think about, why is it reasonable to think about the connections between language and death? And so it's important to justify this not only in terms of like, well, that doesn't quite make sense. There's also important reasons why we should perhaps avoid talking about this in this term. So I'll come back to that next. But anyway, then I want to go on and talk a bit about the methodology and the theory of the article. And I sort of took a guess that I would perhaps here who would be more aligned with linguistics and applied linguistics and similar disciplines, who would perhaps not be aware of some of these methodologies and theories that I'm working with as an anthropologist and as a political anthropologist rather than a linguistic anthropologist. So my aim for the talk, and one sometimes gets distracted, but my aim for the talk is to sort of focus on those aspects of the methodology and theory. And then, yeah, at the end, I'm going to talk about some of the more recent work that I've been doing, continuing to think about the politics of language and death, and the way that states have worked together to manufacture impunity for themselves in order to carry out, to continue killing people on a linguistic basis. But to understand how that works, you have to understand everything else that comes before. So I'll get on to that now. A content warning is that I will be talking about lots of fairly grim topics: death, suicide, murder, genocide, racism, and slavery amongst them, perhaps a few others that I've forgotten. So if you're not comfortable hearing about those things, you might want to take a chance to drop out. If you're listening to the recording and you want to go take a few deep breaths and prepare yourself, now is the time to do that. But just to let you know that all of these topics will come up. Okay, so this is nothing personal about David Crystal. The point that I'm making here is that if you Google language and death, the first work that will probably come up is David Crystal's 2001 book, I think it was, Language, Death, which he wrote following sort of a wave of scholarship and advocacy that started in the late 1980s and gathered pace throughout the 1990s, trying to raise awareness of this ongoing crisis of the destruction of global linguistic diversity, and spoken about primarily by linguists initially in terms of endangerment, extinction, and death, drawing on biological metaphors. Now, from the moment that these linguistic discourses first appeared, there was, and I think quite reasonably, pushback from many Indigenous communities around particularly this phrase of language death, because when particularly for communities that was from colonial era records, and to revitalize them from not having been spoken perhaps for several generations, and to bring them back into the community and to turn them not just into languages that we used in day-to-day life, but were also transmitted across generations. There was a feeling that the finality of this label of dead was counterproductive to the political project of language revitalization. And I think that's true. I think that's an accurate point to make. And that point has been made repeatedly for a long time now, and the message has not really stuck. You still see, particularly in the media, reporting about language death and language extinction, and people are avoiding these terms like dormant or sleeping languages that many Indigenous scholars and activists prefer. So I was a little bit hesitant when I started thinking about these issues and writing about them, whether I was sort of going to reawaken these zombies of language death. And so I just want to be clear that that's not my intention here. I'm not using death at all in a metaphorical sense, and I'm not talking about the languages. I'm talking about people, and I'm talking about people's physical bodily death. And what I was interested in looking into in this work on the necropolitics of language oppression is, what is the connection between physical bodily death and, let's say, linguistic discrimination for the present. And so I want to start out with the empirical basis of, like, why is it important to think about this? And I'll draw in a couple of different examples. I've got references here, but if you want the references, just you can follow up. I've only included the citations that aren't in the article, when things that I've added. So one phenomenon that we can think about that links languages in death is what I might call language suicide. So there have been a number of publications that talk about this issue, where of highly competitive, high pressure, particularly tertiary education systems, where students are being demanded to carry out their university education in a language which is not their preferred language. So, for example, you have Korean universities in pursuit of international ranking and standing, and therefore income, are implementing English medium education. And when this was initially rolled out in Korea, there was a wave of suicides of university students, saying that, and they're leaving behind letters basically saying that there was too much pressure on them to perform. They weren't being adequately supported, and they couldn't bear up on anymore under this pressure. So we have literature on this from Korea, from Australia. through the work of Shivani Nag, for example. So this is one example of language and death being materially linked, people being linguistically pressured to perform and committing suicide as a result. We also have examples of what we might call language martyrs. And I won't go through all these examples, but the first set of Bangladesh and South Africa, these both refer to instances where there were large street-based demonstrations of young people around language issues relating to the medium of instruction. So in Bangladesh at the time when it was East Pakistan, there was an effort to implement Urdu medium education in the universities. The Bangladeshi youth protested, the police retaliated and killed people. So a similar situation in South Africa in the Soweto protests of 1964, I think it was, where 500 people were gunned down. After the semicolon, we have another form of language martyrs where people have deliberately taken their own life in defense of their language. And rather than being simply suicides, I would refer to these people as martyrs because they take their lives as a deliberate and explicit political demonstration. So we have examples here of self-immolation deaths, so people setting fire to their own bodies. In the case of protests in southern India for the Tamil language, in Russia for the Udmurt language, in Tibet for the Tibetan language. This was how I started researching these topics, because I was based in China working with Tibetan communities for almost a decade. I was living there at the time when self-immolation protests started and reached their peak and so on. In the case of Telugu, we have a starvation death. It was a hunger strike to gain recognition and rights for the language, which the protester staff are identified on the basis of sometimes on the basis of like minor linguistic shibboleths for different varieties of languages, or on linguistic difference, like you speak a different language, and are killed on that account. So in Burundi, for example, we had widespread massacres there in the 70s, sort of a prelude to the Rwandan genocide between Hutus and Tutsis, both speaking the same language, but one group being able to target the other on minor linguistic differences. In Cambodia, we had an example during the Cambodian genocides. There was kind of a genocide within the genocide that took place in Cambodia of the Muslim Cham people. The Muslim Cham people were sort of identified as enemies of the state during the genocide, and placed under increasing assimilatory pressures, which at one point led to a complete ban on their language. Even in private, people talked about being spied on for even using their language at home. There were instances of people being dragged from their home, publicly executed when they were overheard speaking their languages. And this then snowballed into an outright massacre when 90,000 members of the Cham population were killed, which was a third of the entire population of Cham people in Cambodia. But it started, as part of that process, there was this linguistic profiling stage. We have other examples there. So I would say that these are all fairly clear examples of links between language and death, which are what I would call killing fast. And I'm going to contrast that with killing slow. So, but we're thinking about death here in the way that we would sort of normally spontaneously think about death as killing, as instantaneous, as switching off the light of life. But I think if we really want to understand the political relationship between language and death, we need to look more broadly at what death means in a political sense. So in this sense, I want to talk about this idea of killing slow. You can see on the left-hand side some of the description of how I talk about this in the article, some of the sources that I draw on there. I think Ruth Gilmore's idea of talking about it as the production and exploitation of group differentiated vulnerability to premature death. I think that that's a nice encapsulation of how slow killing works. It's not necessarily about the instant like assassination or murder of particular individuals. It's more about exposing particular populations to conditions that mean that that group on average will live less long than the general population. So we know that in general, groups that are marginalized and discriminated against suffer adverse health impacts as a result of that discrimination and marginalization. And those adverse health impacts result in reduced lifespans for those groups. So for example, in psychology, there's work on what's called the minority stress model, which looks at how being a vulnerable, marginalized, minoritized person creates stress that builds up to cause chronic health conditions. It's often complicated by things like lower access to health services, medical avoidance because of social discrimination, and so on. In the biomedical sciences, we have work on a concept called allostatic load, which is kind of a physiological mechanism that chronic stress, that results from chronic stress and sort of wears the body down. And in some of the literature on this, they use the term weathering to talk about the effects on the body, right? To wear down the body over time. And so when we look across a range of marginalized and vulnerable groups that suffer chronic discrimination, we see massive life disparities. We see this in Indigenous people in Australia. We see it in racial minorities in the US. We see it in sexual and gender minorities. We see it also people and so on. So we know that just by virtue of being vulnerable, marginalized, and chronically discriminated against, that there will be a biological impact of that political inequality. And so that's what I'm thinking about. In addition to those forms of like immediate bodily death, I'm also thinking about this idea of slow killing and the way that it happens. So when we think about people who are linguistically minoritized, right, whether they are just speaking with an accent or whether they are excluded from public services because they don't have access to a dominant language in a society, we can expect that they will suffer these sort of health inequities in the same way that other marginalized groups do. But in addition to that, what I argue in the article is that there are additional things which specifically pertain to language and various public services, which amplify this effect of slow death. So what are they? So one is in education. So the picture that is the background here, this is the Kamloops residential boarding 2021. They revealed that there was a graveyard on the school grounds where Indigenous children, where the bodies of Indigenous children had been interned. And so we know that like there are examples where institutions that take as part of their mission language oppression, language assimilation, discrimination on the basis of language, have also physically killed people. So there's a direct connection there. But there's also a broader connection in that we know that people learn best in the language they know best. And how that is linked to life and death is that we also know, we have numerous studies showing that longevity is linked with extent of education. when you control for other variables, people with more education live longer than other people. If we think about how a lack of linguistic accommodation for people influences not just their capacity to do well at school, but also their willingness to participate in school, we can think, therefore, that those educational outcomes are having a real direct biological impact on those people's capacity to live a long, full life, to the equal extent that linguistically majoritarian people would. So in addition to education, another venue where this is relevant is in disaster response. So thinking here, for example, things like cyclones, typhoons, earthquakes, bushfires and flooding and so on. We know that we live in a world where these kind of disasters are becoming more frequent. Having timely and accurate information is essential to people's capacity to respond in a way that ensures their own safety as the event hits. And we know that the failure to provide translation services to linguistically minoritized peoples in these situations exposes them to greater risk of death during these events. So there's work on disaster translation. There's particular work looking at the Christchurch earthquake in New Zealand, and there's work, and so it's not just the impact of the event, but people's capacity to survive the aftermath as well, to avoid things like disease, to get to safety, to access the resources that they need, and so on. All linguistic exclusion impacts all of those things as well. So we have another example where being linguistically excluded and minoritized exposes you to a higher risk of death. Healthcare, of course. Are you able to speak with a doctor, a nurse, a healthcare professional in the language that you prefer, in the language that you feel most comfortable in the language that that generates relationships of trust? This is crucial. We saw this throughout the COVID pandemic. I don't know how it rolled out in the United Kingdom, but we had situations in Australia where, for example, we have tower blocks, which are social housing for people from refugee and migrant backgrounds. And often in the early days of the pandemic, the police would show up to lock down those apartments before translators had turned up to provide people with the information about what was going on. Drastic linguistic exclusion there. We saw it in other contexts, for example, where I used to work in China, Tibetan communities there were, many of those communities were left vulnerable by the state, not provided up-to-date, accurate information in the languages that they knew best. There was this massive mobilization of volunteer translation, of people trying, not just getting the accurate information to get medical treatment and so on, very uncertain situation, to relieve that stress. And so we know that healthcare access for people who are linguistically excluded is a serious issue. And I think this, again, is part of the accumulation of this sort of bio inequality, this slow death that linguistically minoritized and excluded people face. Legal systems is another example. Encounters with the police, encounters with the court, the judicial system, with lawyers, and so on. These have not only sort of legal consequences that you might end up in prison, but we know that the legal system and people's inclusion in it is also a predictor of life expectancy in a number of ways. So, for example, again, to go to China, where I've worked, in China, you are guaranteed a right to a court interpreter in the language that you understand. That right is systematically violated frequently. And people will go to court and not understand the proceedings according to which they are being tried and sent to prison. Happens all the time. Happens in Australia. And then once people are in prison, again, there's more vulnerabilities that they encounter. In Australia, we have the phenomenon of deaths in custody, which amongst Indigenous people, where Aboriginal Australians are the most incarcerated people in the world. They also suffer disproportionately and a heightened risk of death whilst incarcerated. And then once they come out of prison, that puts them sort of in a spiral of heightened attention from the law that leads to reincarceration, etc., and all of these impact life expectancy and so on. So if you are subjected to a legal system where the language is something other than the language that you are most comfortable with, that is also going to add to this again. So we have all of these different sort of public systems where if you are linguistically excluded from them, it's going to contribute to that overall slow death that you would experience as a linguistically minoritized person as a result of chronic stress from discrimination. So all of these things add up. And then we also have those other forms of immediate killing. What I was interested to do was to figure out if we could link them, if there's a meaningful link, and maybe there is, I think. But the last sort of piece of the puzzle was this idea of language in life, that we now have almost 3 decades of research, which is examining the causal link between language reclamation, language revitalization, and health and well-being. And so we know that particularly in Indigenous communities in Australia or in Canada, this has mostly been studied, where promoting an Indigenous language in a community has the effect, for example, of noticeably reducing suicide rates in those communities, which makes a kind of intuitive sense. But it also impacts physical health systems in ways that are less clear. So it's been shown to reduce instances of diabetes and other chronic health conditions. It reduces rates of substance abuse and all the associated health impacts of that. So here we have the inverse of what I was just talking about, where rather than linguistic exclusion driving a slow death of linguistically minoritized populations, we have sort of a recognition and respect for Indigenous languages driving better health, right? So these are the real world things that I'm interested in. And I suppose what I'm going to talk about next is the methodology and the theory. The methodology it's really trying to explain how I approached these issues, why I went looking for this information in the first place, what were the researchers, because this work is really just integrating different literatures and trying to think about it and looking for patterns across things. So the methodology broadly, I call it a dark partisan anthropology of the world system for decolonization. And basically what I want to do is unpack what that actually means, because I understand it's a bit of a word salad. So I want to start with the darkness, right? The dark part of it. So this comes out of a 2016 article called Dark Anthropology and Its Others, written by Sherry Ortner, an anthropologist. I think she's UCLA or one of the UCs, but anyway. So she wrote this article as an update to an article that she'd written in 1984, which was called Anthropology. This was like an update of that article where she was overviewing major trends in anthropology since the mid-1980s. And what she said was that the prevailing preoccupation of the discipline since that time was an emphasis on suffering and oppression and violence, particularly in the wake of colonialism. And this was part of the discipline's reckoning with our complicity in colonialism. And so she said that this has become a real preoccupation of the discipline. We have a lot of people thinking about this. She really drew attention in particular to the way that the violence of neoliberalism has become a key topic in anthropology in the 21st century in particular. And so I draw a lot from those perspectives. Where I differ is I shift away from neoliberalism and capitalism more broadly. And I really turned more towards the state as the primary agent of violence. And I'll talk more about that soon. And I just realized I've gone on a bit, so I'll try to speed up so we've got time for discussion and questions and so on. So partisan, so I use this term partisan. In the article, I talked about it as militant anthropology, drawing on the work of Nancy Shepherd Hughes. The idea is that simply that it's anthropology that takes sides, right? It's anthropology that takes sides in conflicts, that takes sides in relations of oppressions, and it works deliberately and explicitly to advance a political agenda for someone in that situation. And who I'm advancing a political agenda for is the people who are subjected to that slow death and that fast death on the basis of their linguistic difference. So I prefer the term partisan because I'm a bit of a pacifist, right? Partisan has multiple meanings. There's this beautiful article, that's where the QR code will take you, called Taking Sides, a Reflection on Partisan Anthropology. It's a nice op-ed style article, which I'd recommend having a look at. So the world system stuff is just that I think, I've worked in Sweden, in China, in India, and Australia, the Philippines. We have to think about the connections between these places, the way that they are embedded and historically connected, the way that concepts, structures, institutions, and practices are in constant circulation between these different sites. We can't treat anywhere as a silo. And the historical framework that I look at these issues, 92, the sort of the birth of Iberian colonialism, the beginning of the transatlantic world, the birth, and the way that snowballs into the modern nation state system. We have to reach back through all of that history to find significance in our present moment and to interpret where those structures came from, right? The ones that are driving the slow death of those particular people. World system anthropology I find useful for doing that. And the last one is decolonization. It means, what's the aim of this beautiful book, the Anthropology of Decolonization, in 1997. And she takes this explicit sense, was like, what's the purpose of anthropology? Liberation, right? It's not better understanding because that's nice to have, right? It's to undo the harmful accumulation of violence that has come about as a result of that long history of colonialism, right? And anthropology should work towards undoing that and aiming at the liberation of particular peoples from particular structures of power. And that's what I'm thinking about when I work on these theories, is how do we do that? How do we relieve that death burden that linguistically minoritized populations suffer under? So that was kind of like the disciplinary background that I brought to my thinking about this. But in terms of the theory, I went with concepts from political philosophy, and particularly biopolitics. And this body of work is on biopolitics, comes out of the work of Michel Foucault. He stole the term. It came out of the work of like an early 20th century political theorist in Uppsala, whose name I can't remember right now. Foucault was in Uppsala in the 70s. No, before that. And then he comes out in the mid-1970s talking about biopolitics, but never citing back his sources. He does this all the time. It's infuriating. But anyway, so biopolitics, he only publishes on biopolitics in one of his books. It's the first volume of the history of sexuality. It's not a very well-developed concept in that book, but it's very provocative. To get a deeper understanding of the concept, you have to go back to his lectures at the Collège de France, where he talks about it over a series of 3 years. But he really talks about it in this lectures of 1976, under the title of Society Must Be Defended, and one particular lecture on the 17th of March 1976. And he promises to develop it later, but he never really comes back to it. He keeps on hinting little bits and pieces of it. But anyway, biopolitics, the way that he described it, is it's a fundamental change in the nature of the state and the way that people are governed within the state that takes place from the late 18th of the state primarily becomes the life of the citizens. The aim of the state is to support and uphold and extend the life of people within the state. And he makes this distinction of a switch from the old state of kings and queens and the right of sovereign power as being based on the right to kill and let live, right? The kings and queens, they could kill who they wanted and everyone else was allowed to live. And under biopower, after we have the switch out of the ancient regime of kings and queens, we have these new forms of state power. Biopower emerges as the right of the state to make live, right? To make live, to force people to live better, healthier, more productive lives, to contribute their labor, to live longer and healthier and the strength of the state comes from the health of the people, right? So the state right under biopower is to make live and let die. And that's where this idea of slow killing works into it, that the state, when populations do not contribute to the strength of the state, when they are seen as threatening to the strength of the state, when they are seen as threatening to the normalization, the homogeneity of the state, they are simply let die. They don't have to be actively killed, but the state just withdraws its support for them and allows them to die, right? So he talks about this as killing, but he gives a nice escape hatch for himself. He says, when I say killing, I obviously do not mean simply murder as such, but also every form of indirect murder. The fact of exposing someone to death, increasing the risk of death for some people, or quite simply political death, expulsion, rejection, and so on. And this is what we're seeing when linguistic minorities are exposed to slow death. It's the state withdrawing its support for them in an effort to build power through homogenization, right? That's what I think explain what's going on. And it's something which is inherently embedded in the form of the modern state itself. So this idea of biopolitics, it gets picked up and developed by a range of different scholars. I'll just mention two in particular. Achille Mbembe sort of looks at the death-bringing element of this system instead of the life-bringing element. He's published around this idea of necropolitics, the politics of death, and governing through death, right? And this is the way that I interpret the slow death that is directed at linguistic minorities, is that it's essentially a way of governing linguistic assimilation, that this violence against linguistic minorities produces trauma. That trauma becomes an impetus for those people to not transmit their language to future generations, to save them from that trauma, to protect them from that trauma. And that becomes an engine of assimilation that drives homogenization at the state level. It's essentially coercing entire populations by a persistent chronic death threat to abandon their language in order to serve the homogenizing drive of the state. And one work that really helped me sort of think about this in terms like how do we come back to that, particularly that idea of linguistic martyrdom. This is where I started with this problem, thinking about people who set fire to their bodies to defend their language, right? How can we understand such a thing, such an unthinkable thing? And this political theorist Banu Bagu actually made a concerted study of bodies as weapons. She studies self-immolation protests, starvation protests, and so on. And basically what she argues is that when the state constantly threatens people with death, and it does that by modulating between fast and slow killing, when it does that, then death becomes one of the few ways that people can assert agency and sovereignty. And that's the ultimate significance of that form of protest, right? Is that people will say that this is the one thing that you cannot take from me is my own death. And the point here that I guess I want to emphasize is that what this suggests is that it's a tactical expression of the political circumstance that people are subjected to by the state, right? It's not an act of desperation. It's an act of empowerment, but it's an act of deadly empowerment. So these are some of the theoretical approaches. There's a vast literature on these things, but Foucault, Mbembe, Bargu, these are really like key theorists for me in thinking about the politics of life and death. I think that there's a lot of work to do in this area. I think that there's a lot of concepts to tap in this big literature. There's a lot of empirical exploration to do around the connections between language and death. I really just tried to map out the terrain in this article and in the presentation tonight. So hopefully some of you will be interested enough to look into this more in other circumstances. I think we need to think about, well, what I've been thinking about is, how has this been enabled to continue? How do states get away with it, essentially? One of the things that I've been looking at is the Genocide Convention. So I went through and read the preparatory documents of the Genocide Convention. It's like a summary of all the meetings that were held in the United Nations from 1946 to 1948 to look at how genocide was formulated in the way that it was. Because we know that Raphael Lemkin, who coined the term genocide, when he proposed the concept, language was central to it. The idea that banning a language, suppressing a language, targeting people for death on the basis of language, that was an integral part of Raphael Lemkin's concept of genocide. He was a linguist and a polyglot, and he'd experienced these things personally. When the convention came out as law at the end of those debates, there was no mention of language. And I read through, it's like 2,000 pages of documents, and mined it for all the discussions of language. And what we find, and this is just one example, there's many of these, what we find is there's just this completely naked admission by multiple states repeatedly that to recognize this in the Genocide Convention would interrupt their regular assimilatory activities, which they saw as part of the normal activities of the nation state, right? And again, particularly galling. The committee should avoid stating the problem of genocide in such a way as to incriminate states exercising their powers in a normal way, right? What this tells you is that assimilation, linguistic assimilation, is a normal part of states' operations. And during the crafting of the Genocide Convention, they conspired together explicitly to maintain a legal basis for that. They worked together to manufacture impunity to do this in perpetuity, essentially. So I have a forthcoming article on this. And I've also written about it. I think there's a QR code on the right-hand side, which you can read an online article where I presented some of the preliminary findings, and a lot more of those kind of the quotes and the naked, explicit logic of wanting to maintain their impunity to destroy linguistic diversity. Yeah, so that's it. I didn't go too much over time. I hope that was interesting and useful. I look forward to the conversation. If you don't want to ask something now, but you do have questions, feel free to send me an email, harass me on Twitter or whatever. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Gerald. That was absolutely fantastic. We're going to stop the recording now, which will